Imam, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. You look super different now.
Yeah, I just completely transformed.
Yeah, I know I did.
Yeah,
I
I
put
like
on
that.
the m.azeez hat instead of the kufi.
I like that. Well, inshallah, it'll be inspiring as just as Maher Zain is.
Ameen ya Rab.
I mean, so Imam, we've been having these conversations, and the conversations are raging on. These conversations about God and arguing for God, arguments against God, and what's on my mind, and I think on the mind of many who struggle with this, are some of the claims of the naturalists. Claims, for example, that religion is just a coping mechanism. It's, people believe because it makes them feel better, it makes their lives easier, it gives them simplistic explanations about everything, and that's the really compelling case for faith.
I wish the audience can see what I'm able to see right now through the windows. Just beautiful rivers flowing and the beautiful landscape and the trees. And a little hint of the California desert yellow. Scoping mechanism that I see God in everything around me. And by the way, speaking of the beautiful windows here and the beautiful views, I wanted to offer my most sincere gratitude to the folks that gave us their home to film, this series, and to take our thoughts and ideas out on camera so that we're able to share that with the world and benefit them.
Yeah, God bless them.
Ameen. But the thing is, you said naturalists, and naturalism is, philosophic naturalism in particular, is a perspective, is an outlook, is a paradigm that is trying to understand the natural world and trying to ascertain reality, basically. So naturalists would basically say that all knowledge resides in the natural world, and the only way to acquire that knowledge is by sense perception.
Right.
So I have to use my eyesight, I have to use my ability to touch, my ability to hear, and so forth, in order to observe the natural world, take whatever the natural world offers me, process that into knowledge. Knowledge does not reside anywhere else except in the natural world. And so what is real is what I can experience with my sense perception. And if it resides beyond my sense perception, then it is not real, basically, according to philosophic naturalism.
There's two parts to this. It's that all things worth studying are the natural universe, and that the only appropriate way to study them is through our experience of that natural universe.
That's it.
Nothing else matters.
Nothing else matters. Nothing else is allowed, right? And so the knowledge of God, for example, or knowledge of the angels, or whatever, things like that, for philosophic naturalists, would reside beyond the realm of what is knowable. And if it's beyond what is knowable, then it is not worth knowing. Until we can discover it with sense perception, it is basically not useful for us.
Yeah.
And religion definitely for them, lies in that realm. And so, religion cannot be proven. God cannot be discovered. Therefore, it is something that the human mind invented as a result of the constant pressure of the natural world, the pain, the war, the loneliness, the estrangement of the world. So we basically invented and concocted the concept of God and the concept of religion in order to cope.
So in order to cope with the challenges and the difficulties of life, but also in order to cope with the unwillingness to answer the questions of how things are and why they are the way they are in terms of the natural universe.
Yeah, this is one way of looking at it.
Yeah, so they're trying to cope, right? So they're saying that the naturalists are saying that people of religion are trying to cope, but I think people of religion aren't just trying to cope, right? It's not just
in
about
fact,
coping.
if you ask me as a man of faith, I actually think that believing in God brings more burdens
Absolutely.
upon the human being. There is the burden of religious devotion, all the ritual practices, which occupies, a significant part of your day. There is the constant effort to refine your character, the constant effort to obey God, to stay within the boundaries, to look forward to some otherworldly reward, which eliminates a lot of the instant gratification that comes, with not believing in God. There is also the regret and the remorse that comes after sinful behavior
Right.
and so forth, the altruism, the sacrifices, putting the interest of other people before myself. If you don't believe in God, if you don't believe in otherworldly rewards, actually your life is a lot easier.
Right.
And if you believe in God, then you believe in those otherworldly rewards, and your life is just as, more difficult, as a result of that. And so it's not always exciting to be a religious person. We can lie and say, oh, I'm always inspired and I always love God and I feel the presence of God. I mean, sure, parts of the day, occasionally, but most of the time, I think, people will tell you that religious practices feel like an added burden
Right.
to the day.
Being religious can be a source of discomfort in many situations as well.
It really
Challenges, things you can't do, places you can't go, people you can't associate with. These are all parts of the religious experience.
Businesses you cannot engage in,
Absolutely.
things you cannot see, relationships you cannot have, food you cannot eat. The limitations are boundless.
Right. So the naturalists will still say, though, that whatever religion you choose to follow or are interested in, their key point is that there is really no point in looking beyond the physical world, that everything should be constricted to what we can see and touch and taste and experience, and that's the only thing
That is
worth
all
studying.
purposeless, it all
Yeah.
has no meaning, has no aim, and that is how they look at the world, and that is actually quite significant and quite consequential. And philosophers have responded to that throughout the centuries and have propounded very powerful arguments to show that there is order, that there is purpose, that this universe is designed towards a particular aim or an end.
And even, by the way, before we even get into the purpose and the order of the universe, if you only view everything to be restricted to this sphere, this physical sphere, and everything that operates within the laws of physics, that's a very limiting perspective on knowledge, that there cannot be any knowledge outside of the physical world.
This is actually a great point. See, faith may be looked at, quite often by people who do not have faith as, superstition and mythology and believing in fairy tales and stuff like that. But there's another way to look at faith, and that is knowing that there are things that are yet to be discovered, knowing that there is knowledge beyond sense perception, knowing that there is knowledge beyond the scope of human conception, actually drives discovery, and it creates a state of humility, by which we keep saying to ourselves, the world is full of secrets. The world is full of things that I need to discover. The world is full of inspiration. And so it's not believing in fairy tales. Rather, it's a humble acknowledgement of the limitations of our knowledge. Every single day we discover new things. Whatever it is that we know today may actually become obsolete tomorrow. And so why are we closing ourselves up to the possibilities and saying, oh, only if I can touch it and I can see it and I can feel it, then it exists, otherwise it does not exist. I think that's a very limiting spirit.
Yeah, this is a spirit of discovery that is quite, it opens you up to all kinds of different perspectives. It opens you up to other realms like ethics, realms like purpose and meaning and ontology. And I wanted to bring up the one, this came up in another conversation. You described this setting where you clear the dinner table and you had your daughter, you have her close her eyes, and then while her eyes are closed, you put the spoon on the table, right? And then you ask her to open her eyes and she sees the spoon. And it reminded me of this really powerful analogy, the watchmaker's analogy that we heard, many of us have heard, I think, before, that if you're walking in a desert and you find a watch, you're not going to say to yourself that this watch is the same as the other grains of sand, right?
Right. You mentioned the spoon and the table with my daughter. In fact, a couple of weeks after that conversation, when my daughter brought up a question about, how the everything is arbitrary and everything is just kind of like colliding and going in its own random directions, I repeated the same exact experiment, and I cleared the table and I put the spoon, and I told her, someone must have placed the spoon over here But then the other observation is the spoon looks like it has a purpose, like it looks like it's designed to do something. So I asked her, what do you think that this object is designed to do? Well, she said, well, it has a handle and it has a little groove so that that there's enough food that sits in the groove, and then we can actually eat. And so if this was some kind of a weird, like if this was a piece of rock,
right,
and placed on the table, then we would have said, okay, the only conclusion we will be able to reach is that someone must have caused it to sit on the table. But because it's designed in a way that achieves an end, then we are compelled to say that it has a cause and it has a designer as well. So the watchmaker's analogy, which is actually quite common, a lot of people read this when they were young, comes from that same perspective, that there's this guy who's walking in the desert. There is absolutely no civilization, there is no oasis, there is no community close by, but then that person randomly sees this beautiful watch that is still operational, buried in the sand. So when he digs it out and he looks at it, he says to himself, not only that someone must have placed this watch here, or maybe it fell off someone's pocket or fell off someone's wrist, that person will say, someone must have designed this watch because it is made to tell the time.
Right.
And because it's made to tell the time, because it's made for some subsequent end, then it must have a designer. This is basically the essence of the argument, and the philosopher that actually propounded this was the British philosopher William Paley, who created this very compelling analogy that are still vibrant in our minds to this day.
So if you look at this watch, you find this watch, he digs it out. Because the watch is there, someone is responsible for it being there. Then also because the watch seems to have a function, a purpose, that also tells us that somebody's responsible for that purpose.
Exactly.
And then also if he cracked open the watch and saw the sophistication of the watch, the order, the rules of the watch, someone would still say that those rules, that order, that structure within, somebody's also responsible for that.
Exactly.
We cannot just explain all of that away with haphazardness and randomness.
So the watch is there, which means that someone must have put it there. Number two, the watch is supposed to tell the time.
Right.
And that means that it has a designer that created it for a purpose. And number three, the watch is also very complex.
Yeah.
It's made of all these moving parts and stuff like that, follows certain physical laws, the hour arm and the seconds arm and the minute arm or whatever, and they're moving with a particular pace. So that is an indication of certain order, by which this watch is designed.
So what if the guy who is walking in the desert and he comes across the watch, he's never seen a watch before. So for him, he doesn't know that the purpose is to tell time. He finds some other purpose for it. He uses it as jewelry or uses it as some kind of
But
tool.
he can still tell that there is some complexity to the watch, and he can still detect certain patterns. Wait a second, the short arm is moving at a certain speed that seems to be steady, and the longer arm is moving at another speed that seems to be steady. And if I look at it the same time every single day, it seems like the two arms are pointing in a similar direction. So he'll still say to himself, there's a purpose to this thing.
Even if he can't figure it out.
Even if I don't know exactly what that purpose is.
Right. So it's just the understanding that there is purpose even if we cannot determine what the purpose is.
Correct.
Right. And so we shouldn't make the mistake of then just dismissing the possibility of purpose. I think it'd be really useful at this point to explain this argument for God in a kind of a way that's easy to understand for everyone. Has someone done this for us?
So there is an argument for God from design that has been propounded over the centuries by so many philosophers. There's a variation of it in Aristotelian thought, but I think its most comprehensive formulations exist in the writings of the great doctor of the Catholic Church, Saint Thomas Aquinas, in his comprehensive, philosophical system that is called Thomism. So we find one of the most comprehensive formulations of the design argument, or as it would be called today, the teleological argument.
Okay, before you get into teleology,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting with an imam and you're citing Saint Thomas Aquinas of the
Right.
Catholic tradition.
I mean, he's a great Christian philosopher and one who has had the most profound impact on modern human thought. And I think all of us, men and women of faith, owe something to St. Thomas Aquinas, because his arguments for God come from a place of a man who has a tremendous love for God, and he wanted to share that with humanity. The fact that he was Christian, I think we can forgive him for that. No one is perfect.
That's up to God.
That's up to God, right? But we owe so much to Thomas Aquinas.
And these are not arguments about Christian doctrine. These are arguments about God.
Absolutely.
Right? This is about the idea of believing in God, not about proving any particular Christian doctrine or anything like that.
And he's primarily concerned with that. He's primarily concerned with, okay, I can't convince people with the validity of Christianity if they're struggling with the very concept of God in the first place. So he dedicated his energy to that.
I just feel like that was valuable to make note of, that people sometimes hesitate to read up on anybody from any other tradition because they're worried that it may not help them further understand the perspective they're coming from. So a Christian might be scared of reading from an atheist, a Jew might be scared of reading from a Muslim, etc.
Well, I mean, we're taught in our tradition that wisdom is what matters, and wisdom must be pursued, regardless of the source of that wisdom. And so we find tremendous wisdom in Aquinas' thought, and we will always study it, and we will always celebrate it.
Yeah, wisdom is wisdom, and is our right as people of faith. Can we go through his formulation?
So the teleological argument,
Yes.
and teleo means purpose, by the way, which is basically establishing that an object has a purpose, therefore that object has a designer.
Right.
And so Thomas Aquinas in his formulation would basically say every complex process has a designer. Otherwise it would not be complex.
Right.
If it's not complex, then we would not worry about it. But if it's a complex, layered, compound structure in its design, then it must have a designer. So premise number one, every complex structure or process has a designer. The premise number two, the universe is a complex structure. Conclusion, the universe
Has a designer.
must have a designer. That's
Yeah.
how the argument goes, basically.
Yeah.
And this is the simplest formulation of the teleological argument for God, which is establishing the existence of God by showing that the creation of God has order, has purpose, has aim, has an end objective, therefore it must have a designer.
So before we can look at small things. We can look at this device here or whatever, and we can say, okay, this is complex, right? But how are we supposed to, and maybe it has a purpose, right? But how are we supposed to extrapolate that onto the universe? How do we know that the universe is complex and has purpose and order?
I mean, you basically start with the simplest, most microscopic things. I mean, you're looking at the atom. The atom is made of the nucleus that has protons and neutrons. Surrounded by electrons. Positively charged, negatively charged, coming together. Intermolecular forces. All of this is the formulation of matter. Absolutely complex in the different layers of its creation and formulation, and it all seems that it is leading to some type of harmony. You look at the human body, for example. I mean, the human eye is actually significantly more complex than the watch, right? It's also designed for a purpose, and that purpose is
To see.
And so if the watch is complex and it's designed to tell the time, then it must have a designer. That's how the argument goes. We look at the human eye and so, well, the human eye is extremely complex, and retina and optic nerve and cornea and this and that. And all of this is put together in order to achieve the end goal of seeing. We might be able to reach the conclusion that the eye has a designer. One of the most fascinating facts that I studied when I was back in college is that there is actually more bacteria in the human body than cells.
more bacteria cells.
More bacteria than cells.
Than human cells.
Than human cells, right? Of course, the bacterium is about 10 times smaller than the cell, but there is literally trillions of bacteria, more trillions than the number of human cells in the body. Yet the cells and the bacteria, they work together in perfect unison in order to keep someone healthy. And so you have complexity of structure, complexity of design, and you have an end goal or aim or purpose, which according to the teleological argument would lead us to conclude that, you know, the human body must have a designer, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so the universe then has, the human body for sure has a designer. Right? That's what we see.
Of course, you know, just for those of our viewers who may not be able to make the connection, the human body is part of the universe. You know, it is of the universe. So we use the human body as a component of that universe.
Right. So something in the universe, and so
because when we say universe, people think, okay, no, you need to talk about Mars or, you know, Jupiter or the constellations. Right. You know, we are from the universe and of the universe as well.
Right. I think one of the most fascinating, and we talked about this before, one of the most fascinating examples of you know, this is the purpose of the universe, the 19 cosmological constants, and how absolutely precise they are.
This actually points in the direction of order. So when you open up the watch doesn't just tell the time, but the watch has this very complex order, following perfect laws, moves with a certain pace, and so forth.
Right.
And so growing up, I was always fascinated, because I had this love for physics, so I was always fascinated with the cosmological constants. And you said that there's 19 of them. So the first one that I studied, for example, was the acceleration of gravity, which is 9.8 meters per second squared. And I was a kid, you know, always asking my teacher, why exactly 9.8 meters per second? Why can't it be like 10.5 or 10.7 or 3.8? There seems to be a particular value, and we just discovered that value. You know, it's a very dialed in number that is very, very specific and particular. There is the gravitational force. There is the speed of light. You know, c 300. It's not even 300 kilometers, you know, per second. It's slightly less, and it's very precise. And these constants seem to be the very foundation of the natural world. We can't do math without them. We can't do physics without them. We can't do any observation without them. We can't do science or technology without these constants. And so I look at this and say, okay, the universe is just like the watch to me. The watch has these gears and these arms and these things moving with a very particular laws, and the universe is made of these components, and those components also hinge upon very particular unbreakable laws that we did not impose. Where do they come from?
Right. Okay, so here's what I think many people will say, folks who are still not convinced. They'll say that there is great complexity, there is great order, great purpose, and all of this could have been designed by some super intelligent alien species who designed all of this for us.
I actually heard this before, you know, from one of my Sunday school students, who was not trying to argue, was just basically saying that, okay, I understand, but it doesn't have to be God. It doesn't have to be God in the sense that we understand God.
Right.
What if this is an alien species? And my response to this is very, very simple. Okay, so the universe is a contingent object, meaning contingency means that this object depends in its existence on something else that caused it to exist. Right? And so, you know, the pen is a contingent object. The piece of paper, you know, is a contingent object. Your suit is a contingent object because it was made by somebody else. It was caused by somebody else.
Right.
So our universe is finite in its size. It's finite in its timeline. It came to existence 13.8 billion years ago.
Right.
The maker of the universe cannot be another finite entity, because everything that is material, everything that occupies time, everything that occupies space, you know, everything that is made of parts came to existence when the universe came to existence. Right? And so the maker of that universe cannot be material. It has to be immaterial.
Because matter came into existence.
Because matter itself was created when the universe was created. Right? The maker of the universe cannot be bound by the timeline, meaning experiences past, present, and future.
Right. Time started at the universe.
Because time started at the universe.
Yeah.
And the maker of the universe cannot occupy space either, because space itself was also made at the time the universe was made. And so the maker has to be immaterial, has to be timeless, and the maker, cannot occupy space either. And my last point here is that the maker has to be infinite. Because the universe as a product is a finite product. And if the maker is finite, then there would be a possibility for other makers to exist.
Right.
And they it would make absolutely no sense for us to have multiple makers. And when we say that the table is infinite, then the table occupies every possible space that tables could occupy, and the maker has to be infinite. So the alien does not satisfy any of this criteria.
Right.
The alien is material, the alien does occupy space, and the alien is certainly not timeless.
The alien still needs a designer.
The alien would still need a designer.
Right, and it could be thousands and thousands of times more complex than anything else we've ever seen in the universe, but its presence in the universe would require it to have a designer.
We would still ask who designed the alien, the material, time-bound alien that created the other alien, that created the other alien, that created the universe.
Well, how about the laws of physics themselves? The laws of the universe are themselves the best explanation for why the universe exists with its complexity.
I heard that actually. So someone, I don't remember, I think it was online, on social media somewhere, where someone made an argument. I think it was a not very effective citation of Stephen Hawking, but I think they said something to the effect of the universe does not need a designer because gravity and the laws of gravity would have been entirely sufficient to bring the universe to existence. Right. I was like, well, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard. Not only that, I would ask you who created gravity. Okay, that's the more direct, question. But I think most importantly, I would say the very laws of physics, including the 19 cosmic constants, they were also created with time, matter, and space at that moment when the universe was created.
Yeah.
There were no prior physical laws to necessitate the coming to existence of anything, let alone this incredible universe.
Yeah, and I see the temptation for naturalists then to say, hey, stop looking past the beginning of the universe. None of that even matters because this is sufficient for us to study. Right? They don't.
If we want to dig our heads in the sand, like an ostrich, I mean, that doesn't sound like the spirit of a philosopher or a scientist that wants to discover.
Ironically, that's what they accuse people of faith of doing. Right?
Isn't it weird, that you hear from some atheist scientists who are supposed to be, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, and are the ones that are telling people of faith you need to stop asking these questions? Right. And then people of faith are the ones that champion the cause of breaching the boundaries of human knowledge. That for me is an irony that cannot be ignored.
Yeah. You mentioned Stephen Hawking. Speaking of extremely complex processes and potential supercomputers of a person, why not just a supercomputer? A supercomputer designed all of this.
Because a supercomputer would still be material, and a supercomputer would still be bound by time, and a supercomputer would still be occupying space. Yeah. Therefore, the criteria of the ultimate maker would not apply to a supercomputer. The answer is actually quite simple.
So I think these ones are a little bit more of the sillier attempts at refuting teleology. But one that I think might be more serious and worth considering is the idea that the universe is a consequence of a process. And the process is an infinite, immaterial, timeless process that caused the universe to come into existence.
So you're basically saying that the universe is finite in its time and size, and it's time bound, and it's made of matter and space. But the process that created the universe or brought the universe to existence was immaterial and infinite, but it's not God. Is that what is being said?
Yeah, so the idea is that the universe is finite, time bound, and material, and came into existence as a consequence of a process outside of the universe, which is infinite, timeless, and immaterial.
And we don't want to call the process God because...
Yeah, because it might be something else. Why attribute specifics to this.
So someone is just trying to wiggle out of the inevitability. I think when they do that, they actually want to imply the possibility of some blind, impersonal process that created the universe.
I think that's what they want to do.
Exactly. And so there was no conscious God.
No purpose.
That has a purpose, that has meaning in what he does, and he puts a universe together to achieve a certain end. It could be just a blind process that, granted, is timeless and infinite and so forth, but it does not have the personality to will action. Mm-hmm. And I think that this, we're going to borrow some, philosophical arguments to respond to this, because this can be very easily refuted. The universe has to be the product of the willful action of a personal God and not some blind process. Why? Because if there is a blind process that has no will of its own, where things are produced as a direct inevitability, and a necessity of the mere existence of that process, then any product of the process would have always existed for as long as that process existed.
And the process was infinite.
And the process was infinite, then the universe should have been infinite.
And it's not.
But that is not true, because the universe came to existence at some point. Prior to that point, the universe did not exist, which tells me that the process had a personality of its own and made a decision, used its own will to bring the universe about. And that tells me that the process cannot be blind. It has to be a God that had his own will and has his own, and made a personal decision to bring that universe to existence.
I think that's so critical, considering that we're discussing teleology, the argument from purpose, right? The argument from design, and the purposeful action of initiating the universe. So this, so far we have that this it must be an immaterial, timeless, infinite, and personal process or being, or whatever we want to call it.
It has to be a being, not a process.
Right.
Yeah. It has to be a being. Otherwise, there can't be. This is just play with language, really.
Right.
If we say that these are all qualities of a process, the process doesn't have a will of its own, doesn't have a personality of its own. A process is a process.
Right.
A process is, the manner by which a person brought something to existence, right? And so we're not talking about a process, we're talking about a being. And that being has a personality, has a will, is infinite, is immaterial, and is definitely personal, and does not occupy any space, and is not time-bound, and that is the one that designed the universe.
So philosophers will accept this. We're just asking them to call this God.
And that's the irony of it. That's the irony. Let's not even use the word God. Can we at least agree that there's
the
a
supernatural
being?
Divine?
Exactly. I'm not going to use the G-O-D.
Yeah.
Let's just agree at least that...
I got to go now. How about Allah? We'll use Allah.
Maybe.
Okay, so here's... I think this is another attempt at refuting these ideas that David Hume gave rise to. David Hume, the very famous philosopher, that just responds by saying, look, there is no order. You're imposing order on the process, but it's just explosions and volcanoes and avalanches and worse things happening, supernova, throughout this realm. There is no order.
David Hume is a philosopher. He's not a mathematician. He's certainly not a physicist. And I think if he knows what we know today about the universe, he could have changed his mind. If he knew what Einstein discovered, he would have changed his mind. If he knew what modern day physicists, quantum physics and so forth have discovered, he would have changed his mind. There is order, there is design, there is mathematical necessity in every physical process of the natural world. An avalanche or a volcano or a supernova or whatever is just the universe restoring its order. It's just the universe implementing its laws to reach a point of equilibrium. In fact, I think natural disasters are a perfect example of how orderly the universe is. If the physical laws of the universe were not orderly and were not absolute in their sense, they would bend over time.
Yeah.
Then sometimes, if the accumulation of these factors came together, one time it'll lead to an earthquake, another time it would lead
Something
to something else.
Yeah.
But if you put the conglomeration of these particular factors together, every single time it will lead to an earthquake. That feels like order to me, even if the end product may cause some inconvenience to the human being, but it still follows the physical laws in the most perfect sense.
Maybe it's not fair to say, but I feel like folks who argue in this way are themselves seeking a kind of comfort because they don't want to acknowledge the idea that there's order and purpose and that sometimes it wouldn't be good for us. And so they want to say there is no order.
That is possible, or maybe it is an angry response to inconvenient occurrences and happenings in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, death of a loved one, or you know, the high toll of warfare,
Right.
or a natural disaster that killed a lot of people, or a personal experience that made someone angry with God. You know, it is quite possible that this is one way people respond to these inconveniences of life.
And they cry out, what's the point?
Yeah.
There's no point.
If there's a God, He would have not allowed for those things to happen. But you know, do you want God to create physical laws and then be the culprit in breaking those laws? Like, that would not make any sense.
Well, if you're a person of faith, you'll ask for it at least. But if you're a person of no faith, then you don't have no right to ask God for anything.
Absolutely right.
Okay, there's also the idea that just given enough time, that this is all a matter of chance and probability, and if you give it enough time, that this will play out, this universe will come to be.
The argument from probability, or the refutation from probability, you know, may seem plausible at face value. But in order for something to become probable, like you said earlier, enough time needs to pass.
Right.
But this time cannot be longer than the time when the universe existed, or the time since the universe came to existence.
So like all of time.
Exactly, which is
Right.
which is all of time. And so let's examine, for example, something very, very simple. You know, one single enzyme of amino acids, right? It would take about 1 multiplied by 10 to the power of 20 seconds. 1 times 10 to the power of 20. I know that this
It's just a 20
sounds like,
zeros.
it sounds like a minute and a half. This is actually billions and billions of years.
Right.
1 times 10 to the power of 20 seconds is the time it would take for a strand of enzymes, of amino acids, to formulate on its own, randomly. Right? Now, how much has the universe been around?
13.8 billion years or so.
13.8 billion years. This is actually less than 1 times 10 to the power of 20. This would be like about 4.5 times 10 to the power of 17. Seconds.
For one enzyme, it takes more time.
Exactly. And so for probability to actually work, it needs to, at least the time that would elapse needs to be at least less than the time the universe has been around. And we're talking about one enzyme.
Yeah.
Considering that there is 2,000 enzymes in the human body, you know, made of protein, the probability goes up to 1 times 10 to the power of 40,000.
Yeah.
Mathematicians would say, which is an absolutely ridiculous amount.
So the argument that this is, but it's all by chance given enough time, is absolutely, extremely, astronomically improbable.
It is mathematically impossible. You know,
it's a miracle.
You can actually say that it is a mathematical impossibility for this to have happened.
Right.
So as convenient as it might be for some people to use the probability argument, it still does not work with teleology.
Yeah.
There is a balance of sorts, and this balance in the universe affords us the opportunity to breathe and live. Right? These very life-permitting margins. If the gravitational force changes by an astronomically small amount, there will be no life in the universe. If the proportions of oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen in our atmosphere adjust by a tiny bit, like a microscopic, almost negligible amount, there will be no life on Earth.
Yeah.
And so you cannot ask me to accept on faith that all of these factors came together in the universe, in the atmosphere, in the human eye, in the proteins, in the liver, in the kidney. All of this came together, and the muscles, and the muscle fiber, and the pectoralis major, and the pectoralis minor,
Right.
and the complexity of the brain. I mean, if you put all of this together, the probability would go into the power of millions and trillions,
Yeah.
which definitely places it in the impossible margins.
Yeah, this kind of a game of chance seems like it was highly rigged in our favor.
I absolutely think so. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, if there's a God, then he designed it in that perfect way.
Thank God. There's also this claim that, the universe is made up of all these parts, atoms or subatomic particles, and each of them is different to each other, and they're repulsing each other and have different forces, and then that they've been forced together into these, puzzle pieces, and then the universe is a collection and a buildup of all of these complex puzzle pieces that were all different.
It's
from
the
each other.
intractability refutation, they call
Yeah.
it. And so God creates his own difficulty, basically.
Right.
Well, why would he do that?
Right.
Why would he create intractable components and then force those components to be together? But that's not what God did. God did not create intractable components. He created the components and put them together all at once when the universe was being created.
That is the big thing.
And that is how the universe was designed. And he created the proper physical laws and physical forces to keep them together. The positive and the negative, they are at bay from each other. A little bit extra energy, the distance increases. A little bit less energy, the distance decreases. And so it's not that he created intractable components. He created components with different qualities and created the process to still keep them together.
Yeah, maybe in a smaller scale, someone might say this looks intractable, but on a grand scale, you would say that there's no reason for us to say so.
They all work in unison, and they work
Incredible harmony.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the challenges with the teleological argument is that it seems to be quite deterministic, right? That if it's about purpose, right, then everything is driven by its purpose, is headed towards its purpose, to the fulfillment of that purpose. And that seems deterministic.
You know what else is deterministic?
Tell me.
Naturalism is deterministic. Atheism is deterministic. When you say that we are who we are today because there is a process that gave rise to our existence, and that process has no meaning, has no purpose, it's an absolutely blind process. A led to B, and B led to C, and C led to D, and that led to who you are today. When they say that we are all nature and very, very little, if not negligible, nurture, when they say that there is no other form of knowledge that helps the mind decide which direction to go, that tells me that there's no free will. In naturalism, there is no free will. A lion eats a gazelle because the lion must.
Right.
Child rapist rapes a child because a child rapist must.
Yeah.
We actually create these laws, and these laws seem to be arbitrary. Why are we punishing someone if that person is only acting upon their nature? There's no morality in this process. There's no free will in this process. There's no choice. Naturalism is the most deterministic process ever, right?
Right.
Now,
But can we save? So I think we'll see that. But can we save teleology from determinism?
of all the different refutations against teleology, I actually think that determinism is the most serious one. Because the argument is, okay, so we are who we are because we are to achieve this purpose. So it is the purpose that determines every single thing that happens today, including human action. I know that this looks compelling, and it is a serious threat to teleology, but it's still wrong.
Why is
It's
it
still
wrong?
wrong. And
What's the
Islamic
solution?
theology actually provides an answer to this particular argument, but this answer is going to take quite a bit to respond. So maybe we'll do that in another discussion or another conversation. But again, just for everyone to be assured, the response to the determinism or the alleged determinism of teleology can be addressed by the qada and qadar arguments of Islamic
The
theology.
conversation we need to have.
Absolutely.
Before we end this, I do need to ask the question that comes up when all of these other refutations have been settled. Who designed the designer?
Oh, I always laugh at this one. So When I assume that there is a designer that designed the designer, then I'm assuming that the designer of the designer is material, time-bound, and occupies space. So you would say, okay, what about the designer that designed the designer? And I would say, well, it still has to be material and occupy space and time-bound and so forth. If we keep going like this endlessly and infinitely, we're going to run into a huge logical fallacy. And that fallacy is, in infinity, into the past, means that there was no starting point. If every designer had a designer, and that designer had a designer, and the designer had a designer, where is the first designer upon which action the second design will take place and the third design will take place?
It has to have another designer.
Because that person will have another designer. And so imagine yourself in a pit, and you're trying to dig yourself out. You're trying to climb out of that pit. What do you need to do?
You need to climb a ladder.
You have to have ground under your feet so that you push against that ground, and that pushes you up to the first step of the ladder, and so on and so forth. But what if that pit is bottomless?
Then you'll be climbing forever.
You'll be climbing forever. There is no starting point for your climb, so you will never get out of that pit. If the process of who designed the designer goes to the past endlessly, we will have this logical fallacy that is called infinite regression.
Yeah.
And infinite regression is impossible because we already experience this current moment of the universe, which means that the universe has already started.
Right.
Which means someone started it. And which means that it did not go backwards forever because we do have the current event. And the current event must have been preceded not by an infinite number of events, but rather
a finite number.
There was a starting point.
Right.
And if logically speaking there was a starting point, which you and I know, both conceptually and physically, we know that there was a Big Bang, then we have to come to the conclusion that the designer himself must be undesigned. That the designer must be uncaused, must be infinite, immaterial, and that should be enough for us.
Right.
The human mind cannot tolerate any further explanation.
Yeah, we have to avoid the fallacy of infinite regress. And I get the feeling that this fallacy will come up again and will need to be batted down again in order for us to make progress on these conversations.
It'll peek its ugly head occasionally. Yeah. Yes.
Well, we'll deal with it when we get there.
Inshallah, that's the plan.
Another amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for putting this together.